Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner, AFRI. AFRI is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. Today we have a new story and we have an amazing storyteller. I have the pleasure to welcome you, Camilo, to Urbanistica podcast. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be here in the Urbanistica podcast. I'm a fan, and so I'm thrilled and humbled to be in your podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and now thank you so much for giving your time to record this episode. Tell me, how are you doing?
I'm great, fantastic. I'm on a 6-hour shift in time, so I'm in the US. It's noon and it's beautiful over here, so I'm having a great time.
Nice. And in Stockholm, it's like nighttime and it's raining.
Okay.
So it's the opposite.
Yeah. I'll try to share some of those vibes then.
Yes, thank you so much. Tell me, did you have a summer vacation or it's not yet in the US? When is it?
It doesn't work like it does in Europe. You do get your vacation, but it's a little bit shorter, one. And two, depending on the sector that you are. If you're a teacher, obviously they work with the school schedule. But if you're in any other sector, you take your weeks whenever. Mm-hmm. I was actually recently in Portugal. And this was maybe the second week of August, and it's the busiest I've seen at the airport. I'm assuming in Europe vacations are different. So but I did spend some time abroad, and it was a good trip.
That's great. So what do you do now? Like, is the new semester starting, or how is it?
Well, for schools, yes. So the new year starts in about a week. Same thing for universities and colleges. For us, it's just a regular year. The one thing that does change is the fiscal year. So everything that has to do with money and billing, that is starting that start a new year.
Yes. Awesome. So let's start. I am reading your book and I love it. So this episode is going to be about your book and also about you and about justice within urban planning in Latin America. So a lot of things to explore. But let's start with you. How would you like to introduce yourself to our listener?
Sure. Again, my name is Camilo Espitia. I'm an urban planner living and practicing in the US. I was originally born and raised in Colombia, but I've been living here for about 2 decades now. My career really began as an architect, but it shifted to urban design and planning back in 2015. I'm right now deputy director of the Department of Planning and Development of a city called Lowell, which is 35 minutes north of Boston. And it's exciting because it's really the place where the Industrial Revolution was born in the US as large scale, as the first big mill town. But before that, I worked in the private sector in Boston, New York before that, and then before that, Miami.
Yes. And tell me, how, with the background of you writing the book, how did it start?
It's just historically planning ideas and planning literature is in general have come from what we call the global north, which is either Europe or the United States. But in the past few decades, there has been a tremendous shift in planning policies in Latin America, and I don't think it has been documented properly and fully. And so I saw this as an opportunity to document that, but the goal of transforming the way people perceive these cities and think about these cities, people who don't live in the region or who have seen them only on the news. with the idea that maybe they understand how our cities work, and changing that mindset of what people have with Latin American cities. But also thinking that it's important in general for people, the broad public, to understand how cities work, with urban planning being on this book specifically from a positive point of view and educational point of view. But most importantly, really the main goal is to try to get young people who are in college or those who are thinking about how to make a difference in their community to see urban planning as one of those tools to fight against social equity.
And when you in the book, when you say social justice, can you more elaborate and define it from urban planning point of view?
Yeah, I'll say that from an urban planning perspective, social justice would be the manifestation of equal opportunities in the built environment. And so cities and communities that offer connections to employment or education, green spaces, spaces to create community, cities that promote healthy habits are socially equitable cities. And they address social justice because it provides opportunities to thrive at every income level. And because they become inclusive, they are welcoming, and they are kind cities. And at the same time, they allow participation from the community, and they create this sense of belonging and ownership for everybody in the city and not just one sector. And so that will be the way, from an urban planning point of view, the way to address social justice.
Yeah, can we say it's like also a human-centric planning?
Correct.
Could be also a way to define how do we make a social justified plan or something like this?
Correct. So the idea is that when you plan for cities, you're not planning for buildings or roads or even transportation itself. You plan for people, and how do we make sure that people have equal access to these things? And so then you start defining these systems for the experience of people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're mentioning this because last week I had also a presentation about urban planning, and I told the audience that, remember, when we plan, it's like the entire goal is about making our life better, enhance the quality of life, and also, of course, the for the ecological, even if it's like they are not matching 100% together. But remember, like we want to enhance our life as a people, not making it only good for cars or just because we need to develop a city, we just make roads. It's in the end, it's about us, social people.
Correct. That is totally correct. The cities are for people, not for cars or for roads. Cities are for people in the end. So how we create these spaces should be centered on how people live, and that's a way to create social equity.
Yeah. And Camilo, I know this topic is sensitive when it comes to justice, and also let's say when it comes to Latin America. How are you credible to talk about this? Like, what is your relation? Why are you taking this topic and talking about it, and so on?
Yeah, when I first moved to the U.S. from Colombia, I arrived at Miami, and as you may know, the fully aware is full of Hispanics. So it was honestly my first encounter with people from all over the region, and it was fascinating to hear them talk about their countries and their cities in such a familiar and personal way. Whereas for me, it was things that I had only read in books, and so it felt, before that, it felt like a distant thought, right? Like when you think about Buenos Aires or Caracas or Sao Paulo or Mexico City, it always felt like the thing that I would either see on TV or read in books. And so for the first time, this felt that it would be more personal, even if it was with that separation of them being the ones from there. But it felt like I now could experience this not so much from a historic level, but more based on someone's day-to-day. And then after that, after college, when I started working as an architect and planner, I did have the opportunity to physically work in the region, in Colombia and Argentina and Mexico. And so that was my first direct experience with these places, now seeing them for myself. But specifically in Mexico, with the water issues that the country, but specifically Mexico City, has, that sort of sparked the curiosity for me to understand how they deal with these issues in such unique ways, but at the same time finding some similarities in what I was doing in the US.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting to see that relationship of those places versus the ones that I had worked here in the United States. And that's how the relationship started as a whole.
And in the book, you mentioned different cases from different cities in Latin America. Can you give us like a highlight about these cases and maybe like choose one and like talk about it in details?
Sure. The book has 6 different cases based on 6 different cities in Latin America. These are things that every city deals with, but I thought that it was important to highlight how each of them was doing something very important and very specific and very successful towards each of the topics. And the overall approach of the book is celebrating what has been done, what is being done. So obviously it talks about the problem, but really the focus is on the good things that the planners, the designers, the architects, everybody who's involved in city development has done. And so the first chapter is based in Bogotá, and it talks about how urban planning has an impact on social mobility. The second one, as I mentioned before, is in Mexico City, and it deals with water scarcity, but specifically about how there are sectors of the community who suffer most with water scarcity and paradoxically enough, flooding as well. And so how the city has evolved towards that. Lima talks about air quality and environmental justice. Buenos Aires deals with food security and how they have dealt with increasing the amount of food supply within the city through urban agriculture policies, school and community farming, community kitchens. And it's interesting because Argentina is one of the world's major food exporters, and it's a paradox that Buenos Aires has that issue, but they are solving it. Santiago talks about the reduction of energy consumption, and again the same thing about equity in what happens to some people in the energy habits and the consumption habits that they have. And finally, Medellin, in terms of digital connectivity, which is essential for both economic and social development. And I would think that Lima, it's a very interesting chapter, because when we talk about air quality and then transfer to the topic of environmental justice, we talk about the things that they have done to reduce pollution, but also to make sure to address environmental justice. And so, for instance, the first thing that they did was deployed air sensors throughout the city, and it helped understand not only how high pollution is, but what is it composed of, and where is it more concentrated. And that helped them prioritize the areas with the highest numbers, but also to establish very specific and precise methods for reducing pollution. The chapter also talks about transportation as one of the major pollution producers, and how the city has implemented the metro, BRT system, bike paths throughout the city to reduce the use of private vehicles. And things like as simple as when you talk about environmental justice, where often the low communities are the ones who suffer the most when it comes to environmental issues. And specifically in Lima, it's because they are either located nearby industrial uses, and so it affects the air quality, or simple things like the fact that a road is not paved, the particles in the air increase, and so it affects their health. So that's a way to think about how do we talk about urban planning and social justice in the same conversation. And so it is possible, and Lima is a good example of that.
So in every case, you review the challenge and also talk about how the city solved this problem or overcome the challenge.
Correct. And it comes also with a little bit of a background from very, very succinct on how they were born and what led them to the state at which they were when they started with these problems, and then and this is how they're trying to solve them.
Yeah. So do you see there is like a kind of pattern on how cities can identify a challenge and solve it? Like, is there like some steps that we could follow in order to overcome a challenge and solve a problem?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, the first step is to look at themselves in the mirror and acknowledge the flaws and the challenges.
Yeah.
And that seems simple, but in concept, but in reality, it's scary because it means making these issues public. It is obviously the political weight of acknowledging the wrongs, the mistakes, or simply the results of actions or natural processes that were overlooked and caused these problems. But once you go through this first stage of collecting what the existing conditions are and understanding what the challenges are, and you collect all your data, then you should engage the community.
Okay.
Not only to be transparent about what these issues are, but to work with them to discuss possible solutions. And very likely they have ideas of what they would like to see and how some of the solutions are connected with the way they live. And so you start drafting objectives and goals with them so that they are integral to not only the infrastructural part of a city, but also the cultural part of it. And then you move forward towards implementation of those tasks to arrive at the goals and objectives that you have set up with the community. But this helps set up the accountability of how really you're going to get there. So then you start the questions of who is doing what is being done, when is it being done, how is it being funded, how is it being monitored, is this all working? And so you go from the research of what the collection of things that you have to investigate in the city and understand where you stand today, discuss it with the community, and then move forward.
Yeah. But the part of engaging community, sometimes they are like a very big questions when it comes to city development. Is the community still relevant to be part of solving these big questions?
Definitely, because without a north, then how do you plan where are you going, right? And so the north is being drafted by the community, not so much by the political arm or the planning arm, but it has to be drafted with the community. The community is the one that's going to decide where they want to go, what type of city they want to be in the future, and very importantly, understand the trade-offs, right? Because if you want more things being done in the city, it needs to be funded, right? And so the compromise of what am I giving away so that these things that I want do happen. You can do anything you want in a city, but unfortunately you can't do it all. So you do have to find the ways of how to get there. And so even in the biggest high level conversations of drafting a vision of a city, the community needs to be present.
Yeah.
And down to the detail of, okay, so how do we get there? Who is doing what? How do we fund these things?
Yeah.
And then you carry on the plan. That's now the executive arm, which would be how do we get the funding through, our political arm, and then the implementation of things like with the planning department or department of public works and so on.
Yeah. But because sometimes when I talk to some cities, they mention that, okay, but if we involve community, it's going to take more time. We're going to get a lot of more feedback that we need to consider. And if we don't consider it, it's going to be a big problem. They will be angry on us. Then we open in another door. So like,
right.
How can cities work with community feedback and opinion in a way that is not feels like it's overloading the existing work and process?
Right. It is tricky, and the bigger the city, the more challenging it is to make sure that everybody's participating, right? Because historically what happens is in a community, only a small amount of group, only a small amount of people are typically the ones going to these meetings. So I can tell you the use of technology nowadays is essential to make sure that people participate.
Yeah.
But you also have to have your in-person meetings in large high schools or auditoriums. I think the way to make sure that there's no duplicate of information or overload of information, and that the questions that we ask do give us the right information, is making sure that we are very, very thorough about what is it that we're trying to find out. What is it that we are really trying to get out of this question? And then the way you ask the question needs to be set up in a way that allows for hopefully either open-ended questions, which are trickier because you have a multiplicity of different visions. But if you select, I don't know, for the sake of numbers, 5 to 10 options, now it's easier to calculate what the priorities are out of a question, right? And so you very likely you sort of have some sort of parameters on how to answer those questions, because you already know what type of information you want to gather, right? It's not so much you want to know, it's not so much crafting the answer for them.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about
that would
this.
be unfair.
Yeah, it's because I'm thinking about this. Now, if we control so much the questions and we already predict the answers, then what is left for the community as like from the democratical way?
Correct. It will be unfair that you lead the question to the answer you want.
Yes.
What you want is to be very clear about what type of answer, what type of information you want to gather. Whether you like the information or not, that's irrelevant, right? That's for the people to tell you. But you do want to make sure, for the sake of the example, you're going to ask people, how much are you willing to invest in this public park? And so the question for the answers could be little, medium amount, and you select what that amount is, or a lot of money. That way you're not leaving, and then you set up what those quantities are, versus somebody's going to tell you €1, €10, €12, €15. And so when you select a parameter for what those answers are, it's easier to get that information. So you will get an understanding of what that range of money would be, or how much are they willing to pay for something, versus leaving it completely open-ended, because then, as transparent as that can be, it's impossible to get an answer from the same answer from so many people. But if you set parameters for what the answers are going to be, that's a way to understand what type of information you're going to get and get it more concise.
Yeah, because how to say, in some community engagement processes, sometimes there are like questions for, okay, we collect opinions, like not more the parameters answers, but more like open opinion. And that's how a lot of different opinions comes in, and cities find it super hard to deal with, because how can we satisfy so many different people and so on. That's why a lot of cities just close this door and, okay, we don't do any community engagement process.
I think one way to mitigate that is to make sure that you don't have this every 20 years, now we're going to talk to you. I think that if you have a person on the ground, boots on the ground, constant community engagement, right? And it's not necessarily a formal exercise of community engagement. It's just having somebody out there hearing to what people are saying overall. You have an idea of what people are talking about. You have an idea of what they want to see. So then your questions can be molded to what you have been hearing. And so again, I think the trick is, don't do it every 20 years.
No.
Because then all of a sudden you're going to get the answers that you don't expect. I think it's more of a constant evolution of how you engage with the community, having, depending on your form of government, if you have a council, having the councilors be present and talking with the community constantly, right? From the planning point of view, having people attending neighborhood meetings often and periodically. So you have this message already percolating through your brain from what people are inherently talking about as a community. And that starts shaping the type of information that you're probably should be finding out in more specific ways. And that way you avoid the open-ended questions that are impossible to synthesize, but also avoiding crafting the answer for them And so it's really more about being knowledgeable of what the community wants and needs constantly.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a good point, like being in touch with the community.
Correct.
How to say, not every 20 years, then like the load of information they were like gathering in these 20 years is going to be a lot. But instead,
Correct.
like having a constant dialogue with them to check with them what they need. And that's how you break down all these, how to say, big issues or challenges or opinions.
Correct. So when they tell you they want more public transportation, it's not a surprise, right? If you are constantly talking with them and seeing their needs, when they tell you we need more buses, it's kind of reasonable, right?
Yeah.
And we need more open space, so it's not a surprise.
And do you think it's necessary that in this kind of community engagement, that the city is there as a politician, as city authorities are present and talk with people instead of giving this to a consultant to do it?
It could be both. What you want to avoid is what we call here the helicopter planning, where somebody just arrives, asks the questions, here's what you should do, and then they leave, and they were never part of the community. But you do need the help of somebody that can collect all this information, the technicality of collecting the information, crafting how you're going to do the community engagement process, helping you write and have those conversations and lead the conversations or manage the conversations with the community. But the presence of the political body is extremely important, because what that means is that whatever the community is saying, one, they are hearing it firsthand, right? It's not a surprise. And two, whatever solutions you're trying to come up with for these things that the community is telling you are being vetted and supported by the political arm. Because if they're not present, first of all, they don't understand what the issues are. So it's really left to the consultant or a planning agency to tell them, here's what we are hearing from the community. If they're not present, it might be something that the company is just telling you instead of being heard from the community. And even more so when the company is telling you, the planning agency is telling you, and this is the things that we should do, they don't know. They think it's too expensive. They think it should be completely different. So if they're not part of the process, it very likely will be a failure of a plan.
Yeah. Because I noticed, like in my projects, when I work as a consultant. So when I get a commission from a city to do like a community engagement activities, there's a huge difference between when I go alone or when I go with a person from the city.
Right.
And it's much better to go with a person from the city, because the citizen feel a bit safer that the city is here. They are not only sending us a consultant, they are here, they care about us. We feel we are close to them. So now when I work, I usually not force, but try to get people from the city to come with me. They don't need to do the activity, just to be there, say hello, observe what is happening, to hear. So they are also close to the people, instead of sitting on their desktop in the city office and predicting, thinking about, how people outdoor wants to live or what are the challenges. So my opinion, it's always good that the city is out and meeting people and talking to people.
Agreed. You bring a good point. It helps them trust the process, but it also helps them understand that the city is really behind this. That if they're going to tell the planning agency XYZ, that they're actually being heard, right? That the city is going to actually try to listen and try to take that and make it an action. Whereas if they're not present, they can tell anything they want to the planning agency, but they know, I just told it to somebody strange, right? They don't live in this city. They don't know my city. I don't know if this is ever going to happen. But if somebody from the city, the council or the mayor of that or the city manager of that community is present, it works both ways. It proposes an involvement, a commitment from the city with the community, but also trust of the community in that they are behind this process.
Yeah.
And it's not just a private effort, it is actually the city caring for them. So it's a really good point.
Exactly. No, I think it's interesting that you highlighted these points. And back to your book, you also write a chapter about the future. How is the future going to look like for cities in Latin America? So what do you think? What should they focus on or prioritize?
Yeah, I think that the future for Latin American cities look great. I think the more mature they get, and it's years, these are all cities, but it took years to get to know themselves after independence, right? After being part of a colony, now they are independent. So it's not that long ago that they were for the first time thinking about themselves as an independent agency. So the more mature they get, the more they understand what the challenges are, but also the more they understand the tools that they have to overcome these challenges. And I think nowadays, especially in this new era, there's more qualified people, there's more talented people working in these cities, in the planning agencies, architects, and even the political arm is also more knowledgeable about these things. And I do think the big difference between today and how things were being done in the past is that in the region, at least, is that today is more holistic, the way they think about planning, right? It's more integral. Whereas before it was not ill intention, it was just a necessity of doing something for the city. It was more focused on let's invest in infrastructure or let's look at housing. But today they look at it as a system, the city as a system, rather with several components rather than different separate things, right? So when the city in the 1800s or the early 1900s said, let's invest in these avenues, it wasn't really thought out of how people really move, where they were going, or how it would affect housing or not. It was just, let's do the avenue because we need mobility. But it wasn't really a connected exercise with anything else. And that's the difference between them and now. And I think the thing for the future, especially, cities and planners should focus on resiliency. And I don't mean it only from an environmental point of view, which is extremely important, but also from a social point of view. It is extremely important that we create cities that can change as things happen in the world, that they welcome the big changes, not only react to them, but they actually thrive on the changes, adapt to them, so that it really becomes places that can adapt to these things, welcome new people, and thrive with them, and change and evolve with them, as opposed to thinking that things are not going to change.
We usually talk about what cities should do. I love to ask you what cities should stop doing in order, like, how to say, in order to create a social justice through urban planning. What should we as planners stop do?
I think that the very first things planners and cities and citizens in general have to stop doing is thinking that communities shouldn't change, or that they don't change. I think cities have to understand that change is inevitable, and so it's not so much avoiding change, but how do you manage that change? Are we creating cities that are resilient? Are we creating cities that are flexible? Are we creating cities that work for everyone? And so this idea that a community has to stay the same should stop being an idea, because it's impossible to evolve that way. I think we need to stop thinking that evolution is not a thing, that cities are not going to change, that the population numbers are not going to change, that the climate is not going to change, that the economy is not going to change. So we need to be cognizant that change is a thing. And so we have to stop thinking that we're going to remain the same.
Okay. More things that we should stop doing?
For planners to stop doing, I think that one of the things that planners in general and cities in general also should stop thinking that ideas come from a desk, and that ideas come from one person and that's how you manage the city. I think that we have to make peace with the fact that it's a collective, and not only it's about community participation, but when you talk about experts, planners and architects and landscape architects and transportation engineers, they all have to, and real estate developers, they all have to be on the table. And all these plans, there's no one man show. This is just really a community effort. It's a group effort. So we should stop thinking that this is a master planner idea, kind of like it was in the 50s.
Exactly. And all this ideology destroyed our city, and we see now that how much segregation we have, how bad is the mobility and transportation, and all many of the challenges, just because like we believe that okay, one person is responsible for planning the city, which is like a kind of stupid.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So what skills you think that we as planners or working with city development should either develop, or maybe new skills that we should learn?
Yeah, I think one skill that seems out of the realm of planning, they always teach us maps and buildings and zoning and all this language. But I think one key thing to learn is listening and observing, because observing what the places are telling you is fundamental for you to move forward. So before you even come up with this idea of we should put a train this way or an avenue this way or these uses here or whatnot, I think you need to understand what the challenges are, but also the opportunities that cities have. And listening to the community is vital. Because not only helps you make the right decisions, but politically also gets you more buyout. If these are things that are coming from the city, inherently it means that the political administrative arm of those cities are going to support these ideas, as opposed to being a strictly technocratic way to approach things. So I think you need to learn to listen and observe and make sure that you fully understand what the place is telling you.
Yeah. But Camilo, are you teaching nowadays or no?
No, I'm strictly planning. I'm strictly working for the city, but I would love to teach at some point. I've been part of create desks and part of lectures in schools, but teaching it's always been in my mind.
Okay, great. Now I was thinking like if you delivering this message about listening to to students and so on. So tell me, where can we find your book and in which languages? And tell me like also the target group, to who are you targeting within this group?
The book is it has kind of an academic tone. It's light reading. It does have data, but it's not extremely or overly technical, but it does have a little bit of an academic approach. So really the intended target is especially the young population who are now going to planning school or architecture school or landscape architecture school, and are maybe in the later stages of their career, or those who are just starting their career, to think about how they connect these two things: urban planning, not just for the sake of plans and maps, but for social justice. Because I think it's not the solution. It's not going to save the world, but it is part of the tools to fight against social inequity. And the book, you can find it in Amazon or Routledge, which is the publishing company, or and I don't mean to be plugging in things, but it is the website. It is my first and last name, CamiloEspitia.com. If it makes it easier, you can go there and there's links to where you can buy it. It's not an overly extensive book, and that's why I divided it in 6 chapters, so that you can go from one topic to the next without having to get bored with one topic. You can look at 6. So it's somewhat, I would say, in the lighter reading, but it does have an academic tone.
And I'm reading it now. I'm really enjoying it. And as you mentioned, like I can jump from one chapter to another, and I don't need to read through like page after page the entire book. It's fine to go to to this city or to the other city and so on. So I like that you put different stories instead of making only one big story.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But tell me, because in the book you're talking a bit about your childhood and you moved, how you went to school, and so on. This part of the episode is going to be more about you. So tell me more about your childhood and your relationship to different cities, because you moved a lot.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, I was born in Bogotá, which is it's right now close to 10 million people. So it is in the verge of becoming a mega city.
Yeah.
Right now, the city fortunately has the BRT system spread out throughout the city and bike lanes with, I think, one of the most extensive networks of bike lanes in the world, the largest one in Latin America. But that was not the case when I was going to school in Colombia. So I had to deal with transportation before all this, which was really precarious and quite honestly even dangerous.
How did you go?
Just public transit, but it was up until the 90s, it was a very informal system. So there were not bus stops. You would just stop the bus in any corner. We had, and I think I talk about it in the book, we had what they would call the war of the cent, which is basically fighting for passengers. So they get the bus drivers would get paid. Yeah, because the bus drivers didn't get paid for a trip; they get paid per amount of passengers. So they would stop. They would, at any cost, they would stop to get a passenger. So you can imagine the driving conditions. But also they would just cram the buses with as many passengers as possible. So it was completely unsafe. And so that created a mindset of how do we think, and back then I'm a child, so I'm not thinking about urban planning, but it does beg the question of me going to some of my classmates' neighborhoods for homework and seeing the difference in how the sidewalks looked, how some of them had to walk because they didn't have a bus line going to their neighborhood. Some of the neighborhoods didn't have sidewalks or they had unpaved roads. Or some of the ones had, the tree-lined street. And so you start to see the marked differences of what the economic means are based on how the built environment looks. And it did make it hard for some of my classmates to get to school. And so that's how you start getting a sense of what social justice is. And again, these concepts do not live in a 10-year-old, but they do start getting you and up to speed and giving you information as to how the city works. And in terms of the other cities, going to school in Colombia, you are very aware of the other countries in the region. In fact, kind of a historic thing is Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama used to be one single country. So it inherently means that our history is very intertwined. And so we do read about the other countries. But as I mentioned before, they felt always distant. They felt almost like a sort of a historic point of view. But it did spark the curiosity of thinking about how do other people live in other cities? How different is it from Bogotá? I was always curious about understanding that. And then luckily, when I moved to Miami, I met some of my friends from other countries, and then working in the other countries, finally, I could see this firsthand. But from a child, I was interested in thinking about why are these things so different, and seeing their economic means reflected in their built environment was something that stuck to me at that very early age.
But you mentioned also that you could read the economical situation just by reading the built environment. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. And in fact, it is a technicality in Colombia. That's how the country decided a couple of decades ago to divide its citizens in socioeconomic classes. And the reason it did that is because that's the way it started bracketing taxes. And then it evolved into, this is how we start providing public utilities like water and telephone back then, right? Electricity. So the way it worked is the highest economic groups, socioeconomic groups with the highest income, would help subsidize the lowest economic income groups in their utilities. So if market rate was 5, for the sake of the example, the highest groups pay 7 and the lowest groups pay 3, and the difference is subsidized by those highest groups, and then the economic groups in the middle pay the market rate. And so the way you define those socioeconomic groups wasn't by income. It was marked by the built environment.
Okay.
I obviously learned this after when I was an adult, but that's it was a coincidence that I could see what the economic means were connected into the built environment. And then you learn that that's in fact how it was qualified in Colombia. And so it's qualified by the typology of your house, the quality of the construction materials, but also the quality of the surrounding properties and the public infrastructure as well. So a very well big house with the proper materials in a tree-lined street will be qualified as a highest income group versus a house that has unfinished materials, unfinished utilities inside the house, that has no sidewalks, that the electricity is coming from all these cables that you have probably seen in the pictures. That will be a lower income community. And so that's how the socioeconomic groups in Colombia are actually measured by their housing conditions.
Yeah. Does it still the same, the way they measure or put taxes?
It is.
Do you know?
It is still the same.
Okay.
It is based on the informality in which Bogotá specifically grew, but it's true to most cities in Latin America, is they grew very informally by having the migration from the other cities or smaller towns into the capital typically, and they start just making their homes in land that probably used to be agricultural land, and they just start subdividing it illegally, and so it means they don't have utilities, right? And so little by little, they get electricity, they get water and sewage, they get transportation, and so what Bogotá specifically is doing now today is formalizing these blocks. And so now it's building the sidewalks, providing the electricity, providing the sewer and sewage, because they realized that there's no way to go back, right? These are informal neighborhoods.
They already
you
settled.
have to provide. Correct.
Correct. And now, also we can speak about the social justice. How do we deal with this challenge and make the justice socially?
In terms of urban planning, it means that, right? It means going back and acknowledging the flaw of how these cities grew with no official or planned implementation strategy for how the city was going to be developed. And in part is how the city planning was done in the past officially. And so it means the painful exercise of looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, this is a flaw, we need to fix it. And so now investing in their sidewalks and investing in their parks. And then the big question for the world is, well, you improve this public infrastructure, you improve the sidewalks, you put the tree, you put down the electricity, you put the water and sewage. Is this going to increase the prices of their homes? Is this going to increase their taxes? Is this going to cause gentrification? And that is the question that I don't know that anybody has solved yet, but it does encourage into that. There is gentrification in our cities because of that. Unfortunately.
But I had few episodes about talking about segregation, social justice, and so on. And the output or the result I got from the conversations with urban planners is that urban planning is not solving this problem of segregation and social justice and so on. So I felt like I end up hopeless in what I'm doing. I'd be like, okay, then what's the point if we cannot solve this? What is your reflection? Is urban planning is cannot do anything or?
No, urban planning is not going to solve the world, but it is extremely important to make sure that people have livable cities, livable places, right? The quality of life of somebody has to do with their income, their job placement, their education, and all these things that urban planning alone will never provide. But urban planning can create spaces that are welcoming, right? They can create spaces that invite the community not only to participate and be a part of how they evolve, but by simply providing spaces that are basic for social justice, just providing a decent open space for people who enjoy their leisure time, providing a decent sidewalk for people to walk safely from their home to school, creating a zoning that has all these uses closer to each other so that people don't have to take a car or a bus for 3 hours, that if they're going to take public transportation, that it's efficient, that it's economic, that it goes to the places that they need to go to, but hopefully even closer so they can just simply walk or bike. So it is a tool because it does provide the connections to employment and education and leisure and entertainment. And the sheer aspect of having a city that provides an environment that respects you is extremely important to make you feel like you're part of the city. I don't mean to extend this, but I think that's one of the most successful things that happened in Medellin, for instance, which was, I'm sure you're aware how dangerous it was in the 80s. And it was a physical fracture between what those communities were having to deal with violence, and how separated and completely segregated they went from the center of the city that had the jobs, that had the schools, that had the parks and the amenities. And what was done in Medellin in the early 2000s was basically say, we're going to connect that. And it has reduced violence drastically. And now people feel a sense of pride. Has it solved everything in Medellin? Of course not. But it is a completely different city. Now you can go to the city; it's completely safe, and it's a beautiful city. And I'm not even from that city; I'm from Bogotá. Not plugging the place that I was born or anything. But that's an example of how urban planning is key for social justice. It won't solve it all, but it is extremely important.
So like we can make a contribution.
Correct.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Camilo, when you were writing this book, what was the like fun moment and interesting moment in writing the book, and the one less fun and less interesting in writing the book?
The fun moment, I think, or moments where the research, reading, I love learning. Learning from others, that was extremely interesting, but especially visiting the places. Because in some of these cities, I didn't go to all of them, but I did go to most of them. Visiting the cities is awesome. That was extremely fun. Eating their food, taking pictures, talking to people, talking to locals, talking to the planners. That was fun. So the learning process was extremely fun. I gotta be honest that the writing itself was a little bit painful because it took me. I'm not a writer; I'm a planner. So it did take me a long time to edit these things. Find the rhythm, the tone. Reread. Have people proofread, correct. So I think that was a little bit painful, to be quite honest.
But you managed to put together a good chapter. So good job.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And what do you want people to say about you, let's say 100 years from now?
I think I would be only interested in having people know, whether it's now or in 100 years, that I did really try to help. That if you Google my name, it wasn't about this master planner or this person with big ideas or anything like that. I think if there's something I would like for people to remember me by is, this guy actually tried to help, and he did his best to talk to us and listen and do the best for our communities. That would be the one thing that I would say I would like to see.
And what motivates you to do what you do?
I work in a post-industrial city, and not to get too extensive, but after the industrial revolutions, these cities unfortunately suffered economic decay. And so they were left in the 60s and 70s in very bad shape. And then on top of that, we did the famous urban renewal projects in the United States that drove highways through our downtowns. And so it fractured communities. And so today we're basically picking up the pieces of what that damage was.
Okay.
So I deal with a lot of low-income communities. I deal with migrant communities, and being an immigrant myself, I see the reflection. I see that connection between that community and myself. And so what gives me the energy is striving for making a better place for them, and making sure that I do as much as I can to improve their quality of life. That drives me. That I think it's funny because it's here in the United States, but it does take me back to when I used to see these communities when I was going to school, when I was a kid, and in high school as well in Colombia, seeing these differences and seeing how so many people struggle with just getting out of their house because there's no infrastructure, and feeling abandoned by the state. And so that's all connected, and that's why I love working for this city, and that's what drives me to write about it, talk about it, and try to help.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Are you thinking to go back to Colombia, or do you have this idea of going back home?
It's been so long here that I think I go back often because all my family lives there.
Okay, yeah.
And so I do go back and visit, but
as a professional, like.
Yeah, as a professional, I will obviously be more than happy to help in any way that I could. If I was called by somebody and say, "Listen, would you mind helping?" I will be elated to go back. And in fact, again, like I said before, I have worked in projects in the region, so I would be more than happy to go back and, as a professional, try to give a hand. Yes.
Yeah. And how do you keep your work-life balance and do your hobbies and so on? Because usually when we are passionate about things, maybe we forget our things getting into each other when it comes to work, hobbies, side projects, family. How do you keep the line between them?
It is difficult, to be honest, because like you said, I'm passionate about it. But it is not that different from who I am, what I do here in the office, and what I write about, what I talk about when I'm in my personal time. It's not drastically different. I believe in what needs to be done, and that's part of how I have conversations with friends. So in a way, it is hard because I'm always thinking about how a city works, and it's just the way I am, but. Because when I walk, when I take a bus, when I take the train, I'm thinking about these things, even outside of my office. But so it's not that drastically different from what I do or think about in my free time. I'm always thinking about how place could be better. But I do every now and then have to disconnect and spend, an hour doing something different, listening to music, or I love soccer, so football, actual European football or football. I every now and then played myself. But yeah, so I do enjoy playing guitar and playing football and watching football.
Yeah.
But even in my leisure time, when I go on a trip, I enjoy eating the food, but also, again, constantly thinking about, oh, this city is great. This is something I should copy, or this is something I would not do or would not. But so it is hard to separate in both.
Yeah. So you're watching Messi playing?
Yeah. He's killing it here in Miami, and people are going nuts with him being I think in our modern time the best player in the world, despite the fact that there's a lot of them in our modern time. Like, I don't know, like Ronaldinho is probably on a previous decade, but there's obviously great players nowadays. But I think Messi is just particularly interesting because he moves so much people. around him. That here in the United States, which is not a list in when it comes to men's soccer, it's not a super strong league, and it's not a super followed sport. But just him coming has moved masses, and it's incredible. Yeah.
So it's a lot of attention going to football.
Correct.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. And which club do you support in Europe?
In Europe, I like Juventus from Italy. I'm not. Okay, that's awesome.
I also support Juventus. I'm a big fan of Juventus.
That's a happy coincidence, and we just had a Colombian player there, Cuadrado.
Yeah, of course.
Who was part of the team. So I would think that Italian teams are some of my favorite, but specifically Juventus.
Nice.
Every now and then when I can, I watch a game, and I do enjoy that team.
Yeah. Last game didn't went so well. Like it was 1-1. And also like it's a bit sad because how to say, we cheer for the team and then they cheat, the managers, the board. It's so annoying, like every time, yes, we're winning, having fun, being very proud. And then you read next day in the newspaper, okay, we will take off 15 minutes because you are cheating, or the board were cheating. It's so annoying.
Exactly. Yeah. I see it all the time with our teams here in Latin America too. So.
Yeah. So if you choose another profession than like urban planning and so on, what will you choose to do and work with?
Football, as much as I love it and I played, I'm not really good at it, so I would be terrible. Music, I play guitar, but also not that great at it. Cooking, I would say, is one of the things that I like to do. I'm not chef quality, but I do love it simply because food talks about precisely what a place is, their resources, their culture. So I love food in general. I like eating food, but inherently means I like cooking and experimenting with cooking. So I think that if I were to start again, I wouldn't mind going to cooking school.
Yeah. Do you have like a favorite? What do you call it? Cuisine or
cuisine?
Yeah.
There's many, but I would argue that Peruvian cuisine is fantastic.
Okay.
I think Mexican food is awesome, and I think Spanish food is great, especially in the south of Spain. It's kind of a different experience.
Yeah.
So I love that, and Italian food, it's delicious too.
Exactly. Now you're making me hungry.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes. So happy to talk to you, and thanks for giving your time to record this episode. I love the book and I will keep reading it. And now we are in the end of this episode, and I have 2 questions for you. And first one is about you giving 3 takeaway messages to our listeners.
Yeah, I would say you should go and try as much as possible to visit specifically Latin American cities so you can see them by yourself and see what they're doing.
Yeah.
And see, their flaws too, but see that there are people working really hard behind them to make these places better despite all the challenges. I would encourage people to have conversations with planners from cities all over the world because it's fantastic to hear their unique perspective to things, but also despite the different type of place, sometimes you hear the similarities, and it's so comforting to know that there's all these people trying to make a difference, and with different methods, and sometimes you find these common themes, and it's satisfying. And the last one, I would say, to buy my book.
Good book. Yeah. How to say? I usually, to be honest, I get a lot of book. What do you call it? Book questions, recording episode, and so on. I usually say, but send me the book. I read it, and then we decide. So when you send me the book, I'm reading it. I already saw. Okay, this is very interesting. So. No, of course. I also suggest listeners to read the book because it's interesting and a lot of interesting insights, especially for us in Europe. We are not that close to Latin America, and maybe sometimes you have these images that stereotypes that not really like matching with the reality now because what we have the perception and the images we have is outdated. We think like it's still in the 90s or 70s, but now it's a lot of things changing.
Yeah,
so
correct.
Your book is delivering a good message.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And now, last question is going to be you asking it in this episode. So, what is your question to our listener?
Assuming that most of the listeners are interested in the urban planning topic, I would say that we all know that the majority of people are going to be living in cities in the future and not so far future. It's more of a rhetoric question, and it's kind of a reflection question for all of us, is how do we envision this world to be in an urban environment, given that more people are living in cities? Do we want these cities to be just? Do we want these cities to be kind to people? How do you, as an urban planner or as an architect or as a landscape architect or somebody who's involved in politics, how do you envision that world in the future?
Yeah.
And have that as a reflection.
Yes. Thank you so much and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Mustafa. I can't thank you enough. And thanks everybody for following the podcast. And I hope you like this one too.